welcome everybody. This is our first 4Ds, then Dreamers, Doers, Designers, and Doubters meeting after the summer, and it's been a quite long summer here, at least here in Sweden, because I have all the windows open, guys. Here, very warm. And how did you have a good time? Yes, relaxed.
Very much so.
And you have to write another post on the also enjoying El Camino about your 1,400 kilometers, right? Walking.
1,340.
Yeah, I got it. Really nice.
That's interesting.
Yes. Today, very special. Just to see here, there is some. My telephone is clicking here. Now it's good. A very warm welcome, and a very warm welcome special to you, Julia, to join us today as our guest at these 4Ds. And a very special, I think, area, because as I said to you several times, Julia, I think in this constellation here, when we are working with meta-crises and very complex challenges, I really believe that open strategy, as it's been proved in many companies like Ericsson, institutions like the Navy, and all the things you described, among others, in your book here. If you haven't read, please. I think the book got all the prizes you can get, right, Julia? Financial Times nominated at the Thinkers 50, and so many more prizes. And you'll be presenting yourself in a while. So I would just like to say, I think open strategy will be the way for us to solve some of the biggest challenges we have as in our planet, because the more the merrier, as I see. And also because a lot of things can be much faster to create insights, but also to get action going. I am completely sold. And so the 4Ds, Dreamers, Doers, Designers, and Doubters. So some practical things. We like the cameras on. We are few people here, so it's a very intimate conversation. And we'll have Peter Sandberg to get the flow and the discussions going, and moderating, and Casimiro also helping with the questions anytime that we get on the chat. We are recording it, and yes, and we are looking forward to a very interactive discussion, Julia. Without much of further ado, leaving the word to you, Peter, so you can yeah.
Yes, thank you. And I'll immediately leave it to Julia here. I just want to ask you, Julia, since Geraldo started calling you Julia, you could also be called Professor Hautz. So what do you prefer?
No, I'm fine with Julia. That's perfectly fine. Otherwise, I feel quite old. If somebody calls me professor, yeah. that seems quite strange.
I just want to stress the point, though, that we're actually listening to a bona fide professor here as well. Was it strategic management or?
Exactly. Yes, that's true.
Nice. And I don't have anything further to say. I'm super interested in listening to your talk, and then sort of like sometimes people raise their hands maybe while you're talking, and I think maybe that's okay with you. And then I'm sure we'll have a lively discussion after you're done. So please take it away.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Geraldo. First of all, thank you for the invitation. It's really great to be part of this conversation today. And as I had a talk with Geraldo before, I really want to have this as an interactive talk. That would be great. So I just want to very briefly introduce what the concept of open strategy itself, but then it really, of course, I have some questions in my mind, but then I think it's really about discussing also what you have on your mind, your doubts, your questions. So that's really what what would be perfect. So maybe before I start and talk a little bit, just very briefly about the concept of open strategy, or I would even say openness itself, just very briefly about myself. As Peter has mentioned, I'm currently a professor of strategic management at the University of Innsbruck in Austria. I do have initially a technical background coming from construction engineering. Went then into business school, stayed, did my PhD, initially worked on very classical topics like corporate strategy, diversification, internationalization, and somehow got then quite some time ago, 15 years ago, into crowdsourcing for innovation, online communities for innovation, into all of those practices coming up in the innovation process, and then somehow realized that I could combine those aspects in terms of all those new practices based on these digital technologies and strategy process. And at that time, also the concept of open strategy was first mentioned in the academic world, and we at the same time saw it also happening in practice more and more. And that's why when this interest started, really searching for finding organizations that go beyond this very traditional established strategy process that we all know. And this is how I also got in touch with Geraldo, because I just, by searching, Googling, finding organization all over the world that might do something different, I stumbled across the example of Ericsson and the strategy perspective community and what they do there. And I think this is how the conversation got started and how we got in touch. So maybe to give you a little bit of insights, why were we looking at new ways of doing strategy? When I say new, I always talk about me and the entire team and all my partners at the different universities, my co-authors and collaboration partners, mainly strategy professors and strategy consultants. And what I think was a perception at the beginning was really, okay, something is no longer working in the strategy process the way we know it, because we realized that a lot of things were happening when we talk about innovation and innovative processes and structures of organizations, but strategy process itself, that really looked the same like decades ago. Like I would say a lot of things that we were even teaching students were dating back to the 60s, talking about a strategic planning process, having corporate planning departments, talking about top management teams that meet every second year, developing this plan and then just communicating it from the top. And we realized that might no longer reflect reality, and that no longer might also address the demands of the reality that we are facing. Geraldo, you mentioned it, all those crises, all those difficulties, all those volatilities. I mean, we don't have to discuss that. And we could also see that there are some inherent limitations. If I talk about this classical, traditional strategy process where we have those few people that meet behind closed doors, we also see that those people very often do have quite similar backgrounds, similar education, similar industry experience, which is on the one hand good. It's a lot of experience that comes together, a lot of know-how, but at the same time, this is a limitation because it just builds a certain way how you think about how the world works, about how your brain thinks the world works, that makes it just so difficult to see changes or to not even see them, but give them enough relevance. Because we see, okay, people realize that's going on, but it might not affect me, it might not affect my organization. And we see that not only happen on an organization level, also on an individual level, that it's what you assume how the world works. That is how you search for information. That is how you interpret information. That affects how much relevance you put on certain information when you make your daily decisions. And the more similar you are in a top management team, the more similar you come to the same conclusions. So I think that's why we we saw just a lot of, let's say, limitations in the current process. That was the one hand, when we talk about seeing new things, giving enough relevance to new things, seeing changes happening. I think you could relate that to all the technological changes that are happening at the moment, but also societal changes, I would say maybe trends, changes in consumer preferences, even changes in how people want to set up their work, how they want to approach their work, what they see as valuable in terms of working. But on the other hand, there is a second major limitation in this process, and this affects everything after developing a strategy. So this is, now we have that strategy, but then we need the actions of the people who act on this strategy, through the actions and decisions, bring it to life, I would say. And you just have to think about yourself or your kids or everybody around. If you just tell somebody what to do, they won't, I would say they are very likely not to do it, or to ignore it, or maybe don't understand why, and you have to engage in so much explanation, and you have to justify, and you spend so much energy in trying to convince people and giving all this relevance to it. And still then it might be difficult if you think of yourself, if somebody tells you what to do, that's not really the most engaging thing to do. It doesn't really raises a lot of emotions or energy, but this is exactly what we need if people get active. And I think that relates a lot to Geraldo, and I think that's might be something where the discussion could go also to not only organizational level issues and problems, but also problems on a societal level. The important thing is to get the action. If you look at research, to get people to become active, you need their commitment. To get commitment, in theory, you need them engaged. And how can you engage them? To create some sense of ownership, to let them feel they are part of it. It's their project, it's their way, it's their strategy, it's their team, it's their organization. And if you are able to create this, there is just a lot of research also in psychology that shows you then you get this action. We are getting active. And I think those are the two major things that we saw in context with openness, is getting all those new ideas, seeing those new avenues, seeing those new things. But on the other hand, having people being part of it and thereby getting into action much faster rather than needing to sell and convince people. So I think those are the main mechanisms that openness in general, I wouldn't even reduce it to the strategy process, openness, how we define it in general, brings. I think those are the main things. And then the beauty is, but it might make it even more complex, what openness really is and how you open up something. That can be very different. So that can really depend on the organization, on your goal, on also the kind of organization that you are. Could be, I mean, digital gives us so many opportunities to involve many, to reach people at the same time, to be able to handle this input and information, to categorize it, to condensate it, to bring it together, to aggregate it. But at the same time, you have also very, very easy tools, analog tools, where you just have certain kind of workshops with people. It doesn't necessarily have to be an online community as it was with Ericsson, with thousands of participants. You could even have, I don't know, 20 people from different fields and have a nice discussion with them, and you are already open. And at the same time, we also stress that openness could be, of course, participation, getting people's view, but it also has to do with transparency at the same time, also enabling people to meaningfully participate and share. So those, I think, are the defining characteristics of open strategy. And we were really, I have to say that we have to admit that we were really surprised how many different ways we find in many, many different kinds of organizations. We saw it, of course, in those large tech organizations, but we saw it in small family firms. We saw it in very traditional industries. As you mentioned, Araldo, we saw it with the US Navy. We even had examples, of course, in certain specific forms with the CIA, with state and military organizations that might not necessarily be characterized as open in the first place. And that was really interesting to see that you can say, okay, you can do it in your own way. And this is something that I think is also something that characterizes openness, that there is not one way to do it. It brings a lot of opportunities, but of course it adds complexity. So just some thoughts, and then I'll end, and that's the most, the only monologue that I want to do today, and then hear your thoughts, your takes, is some questions that always come to my mind then if I talk about openness, and obviously I'm quite excited about it. I really believe in the potential. Then the question is always, why don't we see much more organizations, different types of organizations, profit, non-profit, also governmental institutions to be more open per se in their processes? What hinders them? What might be the biggest barriers? What are maybe also things that we have to consider on individual levels? Are we ready for openness per se? Are the people ready for openness? How could we not only help organizations but individuals to be more comfortable with openness? And then, of course, as you, Geraldo, said, is really, okay, can we go beyond, I would say, just organizations and just the classical corporate strategy process, and can we apply it, or is it already applied out there in different fields? Of course, we see some kind of participatory movements and processes in the political domain, in the public domain. We have open science movements, we have different kind of open movements. And then maybe also a question is, do you have the feeling that this openness has increased over the last couple of years? Because I know over quite some times we always said and started everything also when we talked to students and organizations, the last decade has brought increasing levels of openness everywhere. Not quite sure if we can say that for every field also now, if that has been a certain decade and now we are, I don't know, stalling or
Can you hear?
Yeah,
We lost her.
like we lost Julia. Oh, yeah,
I think she's frozen.
yeah. Well, let me go. Yes.
Hello again, Julia.
I'm sorry, was it just me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Now,
So I hope you heard at least some of my questions
Yeah.
that I posed. So I'm already done and open for discussions and questions and all of your thoughts. So that's from my side. Perfect ending.
Thank you, Julia. Thank you. And let's address the questions that you had, sort of like regarding if we were ready for openness and how we become more open. But what I would also like to explore, and we can do that later, is sort of like, I guess there's a spectrum, sort of like how if you only apply openness sort of like to the input, but then there's still a secret team drafting the strategy that then needs to be pushed out, and sort of like how involved can you actually make people also in the actual formulation of the strategy? That would be interesting. But we already have some hands raised here, and I think Kasi, you were first.
Yeah, thank you. It's a fascinating topic, Julia. Thank you very much for starting the discussion, and also we had some pre-reading, by the way, prepare the session. Disclaimer: I work as adjunct professor in a business school, And one of the things that we do is, of course, the strategy and strategy formulation, and then co-creation of value connected with this, which is a lot of openness as well. But then I was really interested in one of the comments that you said at the very beginning. One of the problems to be open to new ideas is that in many organizations, this is still done by the people who have fundamentally been taught the same, or they know the same things, or they are a kind of, there's a template of decision makers in organizations. And in order for us to change a little bit this model, we should change as well how they are educated. And not only them, but also anyone in the organization. So do you think that, because I love the topic, but I still think when I see the syllabus of the courses for strategy in my business school, I still see similar traditional ideas. Have you seen a change in the way that education or the way that the input of the people making decisions happens?
I mean, that's a good question. And I think that is, of course, where it also has to start, what we teach people in business schools and how we teach them. Because I think it impacts a lot how we access information, how we assess information, and what information we see as relevant. And of course, we do have certain cognitive biases just by the nature of our brain that differentiate between the sources of information. So it really needs to happen at an individual level, that I say, okay, no, I see that the input that I get from somebody who is not in my field, who is not a C-level manager, who comes from a very different industry, also as relevant as my strategy. And I think that's a big hurdle to overtake. I think, at least that is my perception, that the younger generation in our master programs, in our postgraduate programs, are getting better in this and are no longer having this tight assumptions that older generations might have. But I think that is a very important point, and it relates a little bit to what Peter said. There is a difference between gathering all this information and having this everything together, and then still basing your decision on the beliefs of the core group, because most of the cases decision-making power remains with the smaller teams. So the important thing is that they really consider what's coming in and let it influence in their decisions. Otherwise, the whole exercise before, it's nice and it might raise some new ideas, but I think it is not leveraging the entire potential.
Very interesting. I will come back to that later on.
Jan, please.
Now, I was going to continue that discussion on the gathering of input versus formulating the strategy itself, because this one is developed where there is, as it said, is one of the articles that was sent up. It's not a democracy. So I was thinking, since a lot of the things we are formulating here are actually going to be formulating, at least in a representative democracy. That means that you should also be able to influence the decision and the strategic direction, since a lot of these happen in the public sphere. And at least here we have, as I said, at least the representative democracy. And I wonder if there's been any thought regarding that, if you move this from like the corporate world to the more general world, because to me that would be, maybe I'm moving too fast, but it's a question that I started to think about when it said that this is a prerequisite. Is really there has to be somebody making the decision, and yes, maybe it's all of us that has to make the decision. Okay.
No, that's a good point. And I think that's always something that comes up with openness. And that's the question of decision rights. I mean, who in the end will be the ones who are making the decisions? And do we also have the influence on the decision itself, like we do have in politics and in society?
Yeah.
That's a good point. If I relate it back to the corporate world, where of course decision making is something very sensitive, and sometimes that's just domain of managers, and that's okay. But what we saw here is opening up and having people part of the conversation, even though it's gathering input, but it's also a conversation, and we saw it can be quite powerful in terms of not having formal decision rights, but informally being able to influence the direction where you're going and influence a strategy, not necessarily by saying I'm voting for this or in the final decision I can put it, but by voicing and having this voice multiplied, the talk and the discourse goes into a direction that might not have been happening before. So even though it is not a democracy in an organizational setting, we saw there is a lot of power in this. And that might be also, of course, something that that worries managers, because, of course, it's a kind of loss of control and loss of power, obviously, but might even be more relevant on a societal level. And I mean, we have seen that, of course, in different kind of movements where people are raising their voices, are getting together, that they can influence discussions and discourses. So there, I think there is a big overlap where those two fields, maybe also organizational field, can learn from what has happened by those movements.
Thanks.
Claus, please.
Yes. I wonder if when you're talking, I immediately associate with something that Geraldo and I are working with in the community that we share, another community which this is a bit of part of. And we're running a self-organization structure there. And there are various methodologies for that. There is something called sociocracy. There is a concept called TEAL, you know, I'm sure. I don't know if you also are acquainted with the Robert Keegan and something called deliberate developmental organizations. So it would be interesting to hear what your reflections are, well, the relations to that. Because I think, and when you speak about openness, that these the self-organizations, they really push the openness to its extreme, and several things that you have mentioned here about how do you take the decisions in a self-organization way, and it's very tricky, and it really pushes you have to get rid of the concept really of us encouraging them, because we are all on the same level. So it's a big we.
Yes.
Yeah. I can see that you are familiar. So let's hear a bit what your thoughts about that.
I mean, that's a good point, because here you can obviously see that structure and strategy are very closely linked, as that's a fundamental of strategic management. But here you can see that this way to, especially those self-organized organizations, resemble just many aspects of open strategy. If we think of transparency, very often everybody in those self-organized organizations has just every information in terms of everything that's out there. And in terms of participation, everybody is participating in those processes, whereas a lot of decisions are not taken in this corporate headquarters, but at the same level. So I think there is a big overlap conceptually. We are currently studying some self-organized corporations. I think it's okay to say that we are currently working together with VC. That you might know, it's a self-organized, holacracy organized organization, also with self-organizing teams within the structure, and they have what they call radical transparency, and that's just very interesting to study at the moment. We are looking here really at this transparency aspect, what that makes with or what that creates within the organization, that everybody just has the relevant information. Again, this goes into this direction. You don't have to justify so much your decisions or things that are happening, even if those might be negative things or negative developments, because the people, they have the information, they see it, they can understand it, they can interpret it, and they know what's going on. So there is a big overlap in terms of those two concepts. Of course, there's self-organizing teams I wouldn't say, maybe you can say they are quite radical if you compare them to a traditional organization.
Yeah.
So for them, of course, they have this in their setup, in their values. So participation and transparency might be something that is just part of the system. Something that I wanted to add on this one, on the self-organizing aspects, I think they show so nicely, and that's also relates to openness, that it's not necessarily, and that's also sometimes something that I get, is that you have something like chaos or everybody just does something. It requires even more preparation, more structure in a sense, more rules. It's not like everybody can do everything, but it's really a very, very careful setup of management. Just, I would say, on a horizontal level, that's something that we got. So it requires, like openness, it requires a lot of time and effort to set it up. But I have the feeling once it's working and once you have established it, it has a lot of values. I mean, with Visi, we just saw it in the context of crisis. They had a hard time and were going through some restructuring, but they were relying on their transparency, on this amazing transparency that they had, and they were just able to do it much quicker, had the commitment from everybody, even though it was not popular. Even people were saying, we have to do something, because we know, we see the numbers. There is no, you have to do something. They went even to the leadership team, because they said, we see it. I mean, we know what it means. There's no way around. And of course, then you are very quick in doing things and you're much more successful, rather than surprising your employees and saying, you know, guys, we are having a hard situation. So that's the difference here. So I think those were just the experiences that we had in terms of self-organization. Definitely very big overlap.
Okay, good to hear.
Thank
Nice,
you.
really, really great to hear. And yeah, thanks so much for writing the book. I really enjoyed it this summer, reading it, and I was marking like almost every page because it's so related to what I encounter kind of in my day-to-day work. I'm a strategist facilitator and I help leadership teams strategize. And kind of a couple of years ago, I summarized it as co-creation is co-ownership. That was kind of the philosophy of my company. So when I read the book, I was like, oh my God, this is the book, like fantastic. What I'm really curious about, and I'm just surprised, you know, why it's not more widely adopted. Also, when you know, like 70% of people in companies don't even know what's a strategy, those kind of numbers really stand out. What is the number one benefit that kind of captures the attention of like senior leadership teams in commercial companies? I have an idea about it, but what do you hear back when people read the book and they're like, oh, I'm going to give it a try, open strategy within my company? What are the things that capture their attention? They're like, oh shit, I really need to try this.
I would say really most of the time it's getting the people on board, having the employees and getting the engagement of the employees, because I think that is something that the organizations really have the feeling that it's getting harder and harder. Everybody has those Gallup numbers in the background where you have this large proportion of people that are disengaged, that are quickly changing. Everybody has a hard time for finding those employees and is trying to come up with conditions to just attract those people. So I have the experience, at least with the companies that we are working, that they really care about the employees and the people, and they realize that they need to do something, that they are part of it. And for them, it's just a tool to really, really increase their commitment, their satisfaction, that they have them all aligned, that they know, okay, that's why we are here for, that's where we are going, that's our direction, and we are part of it. So I have the feeling when the organizations realize that that is a tool that is helping them on that aspect, it's even cooler than getting a lot of new ideas, because today they often don't worry about the new ideas and getting those. Of course, they also come, and very often they are very valuable. So that's, I would say, that's also very relevant. But I have the feeling that this getting the commitment from the people, having them as part of the team, really creating this buzz that's so difficult to create and having everybody on board, I have the feeling that that's what makes then the CEOs and the leaders that get excited about it, that really makes them excited. I don't know if that is the same that you experienced or that you had in mind, or if you had a different thought.
Yeah, for me, it's kind of that's the way to reach like the kind of the key benefit, and the key benefit is like faster execution, faster strategy execution. So instead of you have more, I made like a video about it. So I read the book, I really liked it, and I thought the main thing that I'm kind of messaging to the leaders I work with is like, okay, it's a little bit more complex at the beginning. Needs some more thinking. You have to set it up really right, because otherwise it becomes chaotic and you don't get the right output. But then all the people involved in execution of the strategy, they can act twice as fast. That's kind of my assumption and the story that I use. And I really strongly believe in it. I saw it. I saw it happening. But also I think it's really about the culture of the company. So I tried it one time with a private equity fund, and we did like a stop, start, continue on strategy with 1,600 people simultaneously. And the CEO hated it because he was like the super red, like, dominant leader. He hated it. While at some other companies, you see the culture is just right for it. So I think this culture question and like kind of a checklist in which organization doesn't actually work is really key. And I'm still surprised, like, it's why that private equity fund didn't do the right things with it, because it was super powerful that they tried this experiment. It was like a little step for the leader to just open up to the results and do something even symbolically with it. They just deleted the whole momentum, which was a shame.
Yeah. And I think that's then something, okay, where you even create a negative thing, because that's what we see. You involve people.
Exactly. If you don't do anything
give them,
with it,
that's worse than don't even starting with it, because then but giving them the hope, let's say, and then not
that's the key point.
Yeah, that's something that is exactly. And I think definitely what you said, it's okay having them on board in order to just being able to realize the strategy, because very often, I mean, you hear that all the time. We have this great document, we spend so much time, we are coming up with this strategy that we have, and then we communicate it, and then we all have the feeling nothing is happening, and we engage so much energy in those roadshows and presentations and talks and sending it out on the web and all those stuff that is okay, but it's just not working in a way that is really effective. And I think that's exactly the point. Yeah.
Thanks for sharing. Johan, I'm also super curious what you want to discuss.
You're muted.
We cannot hear you well, Johan. No, it's not a mute. I think that it's the audio configuration.
We hear you good now, I think. Or not?
Can I take my question in while?
No, please.
Yeah, I agree with you, Julia, and the top, and you just. I just want to bring one thing that I wish that it was recognized, and from Ericsson, I think definitely an important point of open strategy is superior insights. We get much better insights. So I'm not even talking about ideas, Julia, but actually insights about where the industry is going. And so let's say I would wish when we are about to do a $6 billion acquisition that early on, I know the difficulty with secrecy and so, but there are ways to do that, how you engage with your own developers. It's amazing. Superior insights than we can get in a small group of 20 people at the top. So basically what Mintzberg talks about so much about communityship going forward instead of leadership, right? And then my thoughts, and it's more like we are discussing here, how this applies more and more also to organizations, not only companies, right? I think definitely for the renewal of companies is going to be so important. And we discussed this also with Mintzberg, because everybody is is very, how to say, nowadays, especially in this community, a little bit disappointed what companies actually can do, because everything is related with growth, more profit, right? And then there is a tension with climate and so much more. But anyhow, but there is a, how to say, a movement here in Sweden, or how do you call project, right? That is called Medborgarrådet. So they are actually helping politicians of how to look at climate going ahead. Okay, and for me, this is open strategy, right? In a nutshell. So my question sometimes is more like, in this case that I'm talking about, it was a group of maybe 50 people, I don't know, it was a smaller group. And there, to your point, just how can maybe we do that at scale, right? I mean, if you go to open innovation, a lot of people say that some of the challenges like cancer and so is going to be through crowdsourcing, right? The same thing here. How can we do at scale? It's a dream I have here. I'm putting the dreamer's hat, and now I'm being talked about. So I hope you Johan, have got your phone to work.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Okay. I found the setting. So, open strategy as a term has the word open as strategy, and sort of simplified, open implies that it's participatory and you can influence the strategy. But if you take the word strategy and try to rethink that, and I think that's the key that we haven't actually discussed that, because you mentioned that once we have a strategy, it's just the value proposition is faster strategy execution. And that always confuses me, because every strategy organization I have met is only doing strategy execution, right? And who is actually doing the strategy sort of is confusing. But I don't think strategy execution is the same as strategy. But in our current mentality, collective mentality, it is. Because we believe collectively that, there is a given way forward, right? There is a strategy we can execute and reach whatever goal we want. And unless you change that, perhaps the dream of open strategy will not fly. And there's a few things that happens with open strategy. One is, if you share the ownership of the strategy, right, it gets diluted. There's not a single person responsible for the strategy all of a sudden, or a small group. So it gets diluted. And you might end up, you might think that you end up in sort of the tragedy of the commons, right? I don't think so, but I think that's a underlying thought that might be there. And the other part is that, how often can you change strategy, right? In the complex reality, you probably need to change strategy twice a day at least. But that is so unheard of, right? No, are you stupid? I mean, that's not how we do business. We set the strategy and then we execute, and then we deliver on our commitments or whatever, right? So until we shift that mentally, a shared ownership, which is strength for most corporations, and we might change strategy before lunch. That's okay. Before that mentality has sort of changed, which I think needs to change, is it possible to do what is framed as open strategy?
I think those are very good points. And I mean, they go very much into also what we define as strategy, what we see as strategy. I remember quite some years ago, we also discussed, I think also with Henry, if every open strategy has to do something with emergent strategy or not, or where is the border between those two concepts, and do they overlap, yes or no, and what does it mean? And is then every emergent strategy per se an open strategy or not? So that were things that we were discussing. So certain things, I think what we have to change is definitely or at least that's my opinion and what I've learned and what we have seen in research, is that we have something that is created and written down on a piece of paper every year, and we will execute that for the next 5 years. And executing are the people somewhere in the organization, and those are two parts that can be separated, and they are responsible for that, and they are responsible for that, and at the top they are making that decision. I think it's very much, it's not that clear, and that goes a little bit into the concept that Henry Mintzberg is always talking about emergent strategy, and that's at least how we see it, or when we talk with organization, is something that we say, okay, where are we at the moment? Where do we want to go in the future, and how can we get there? And what does this mean for everybody in the organization? Might mean different things, but in the end, that's where we get. And therefore, it's also so difficult to then also distinguish it or separate it clearly from the purpose. That's the next concept that comes in, because that influence where we want to go in the future, and those are very much linked things. But if you have those 3 questions, I think, and say, okay, where are we, where do we want to go, how can we get there, and now let's reflect on this jointly. And then, as Haraldo said, okay, gather first information. Now, gathering information might not mean we decide what we do, but we can influence the direction, at least. Where is it? Is it this way or this way? So, and then what does this mean for me in my everyday activities to get there? And that might change every day. Also, as you've said, one day that might mean we need to do that, and then the next one. But that's what we think it's so important, that everybody is somehow part of this process. And it can be different levels and might be different for everyone, but at least if you have the feeling that you are somehow part of this process and about all those, where do we go, how do we get there, you reflect much more on what does this mean for me and my behavior and my decisions that you are taking, because you are no longer separating them so much in terms of, okay, that's what they said, but that's what I have to do every day. And there is no linkage for me, because I was missing all these steps and informations between, and that's just not the case. They are not that separate. And I think that is something that needs to be changed. At least that's my assumption, that we need to get rid of this separation. I don't know if that resonates or is somehow addresses what your comment, or is going into another direction.
Thank you. Maybe you still want to chime in again.
Yeah, I was curious, Julia, you mentioned that you work with an organization that also in a crisis, they can kind of had to maybe restructure. I'm now working, my biggest client is going through a huge reorganization, and if I see how they handle it, I think, oh my God, this can be so much better done. I think if you do it like radically open, you would almost say, hey, we have to go here. How are we going to do this in a social way? And like leave it almost to the organization. And that's of course probably not possible with something that complex as a restructure. But can you tell a little bit more about that case and how they approach it? How to do open strategy applied to restructuring? Like, I'm super intrigued by it.
Yeah, I think that's a direction that our research took, just I think because we saw suddenly so many organizations in different kind of crises over the last years. Now that is something that has even been funded by the Austrian National Bank, because they saw such a wave of insolvency and were interested about what could be done. So they were financing different kind of projects. So that research effort is really something that is financed by them currently. And it's of course interesting because it's an extreme context. And of course you would say, yes, more information is helpful, being more transparent. But on the other hand, you always have this, okay, are people ready to interpret this in the right way? Are you creating emotions and expectations that might even be counterproductive? So there is a lot of, I would say, a lot of more complexity. At the same time, you very often have a time pressure. It has to go very, very quick. So now you mentioned, okay, it needs a little bit more time to set it up. but then you are quicker in terms of openness. Sometimes in restructuring, you might not have this time to set it up. So what we see here in those organizations that we were studying, of course, it helps to have it up front. Like you mentioned it, with culture, that people are comfortable with transparency, with participatory processes up front already, and not only in terms of crisis, because then it's just might not be possible to be established. And then we saw that in this context, it's really a kind of very delicate balance in terms of how open can I be, but when do I have to close again? And not necessarily because it's a bad thing, but in order to just, on the one hand, you have sensitive information that cannot be leaked or that might not get outside of the organization, but most of the time it's really not creating fear, insecurity among your employees. And that has a lot to do with the culture that we were able to create. Then we see, again, if you involve the people, if you say, okay, we need to change something, how can we change it? You have worked with the customers, you have worked with suppliers, you have the knowledge, get those ideas that Geraldo mentioned, very specific ideas. You might be able to come up with a new way to restructure. And again, restructuring means a lot of change. And if you can change, or you can only change if the people are willing, and if you have their commitment, again, commitment, if they're part of the process, yes, they see it. What we see, of course, as it's a very extreme context, you need a very, very careful balance. And I would say in such situations, the corporation itself might not be able to do it. So managers do have so many issues on the table. They definitely need somebody who helps them, who supports them, who is an intermediary, who has those task of balancing openness and closure. So that is what we saw in terms of restructuring and crisis. And that is something, I mean, that also relates to when we talk about societal level, does not necessarily mean that more openness is always better. So that is definitely something that we learned.
Johan?
Yes, I have an anecdotal observations that might be relevant, sort of. It comes from the hypothesis that classic strategy is great for the known, while open strategy is great for the unknown or the complex world or whatever. And I'm taking a course in complexity. It's given by Lund University from the business management department or whatever. And it's pretty good. And I noted in sort of in an open chat with all the students and participants that the ones that came from the private sector, they had one feeling of complexity that was not very complex, sort of. But all the people from the public sector, from government or whatever, from that type of institutions, they sounded more familiar with complexity and the unknown. I mean, and my hypothesis is many institutions and governmental organizations, they need to plan for the unthinkable. That's part of the scope. Is that something that you have noted, Julia, or others?
I think that's a good observation, and I could just assume that people from public institutions, just per se and per tasks, are much more confronted with different stakeholders, different actors with very different interests that very often are just going against each other, much more than organizations. Although we could argue that organizations today, with all the things that are going on with sustainability and the environment, are realizing that there might be more stakeholders out there that they have not seen so far, or not taken as relevant as it would be needed so far. So organizations, profit organizations, might not be as familiar as those public institutions in being in this constant, let's say, balancing interests, or needing to have this overall picture with all those different stakeholder interests. Profit organizations so far had the main goal, if you come from the shareholder perspective, just being profitable. And that's the goal, and that's the interest we are serving. And that might change, and has changed, and might even change more. So they now need to learn to handle this complexity and handling those different let's say, interest of actors, maybe we could assume that having a more participatory approach to processes allows them to learn to handle those interests. Because if you have those stakeholders and those people, those interests you have to handle with you, of course, it's easier to address them, or at least to negotiate them together, rather than you are responsible to find a way to address all of those. Those of course, creates a lot of complexity that is very difficult. So that's just my assumption from such a perspective. Don't know what the others think, what might be takes on that.
Thank you, Julia. I have also been a bit involved in foresight and as well as open innovation and how it relates to strategy. And at least with in the context that is my day job, I work with a lot of large multinationals, and it seems to always be kind of like this invisible gap between people involved in innovation and foresight and the strategic development, you could say, or formulation, and I wonder sort of like if you have any, because it feels for me like if you do the open strategy approach, you would actually be able to marry those two or three areas together, sort of like more seamlessly. Is that a correct assumption from my side?
I would say that, yeah, definitely. First of all, I think that we from the open strategy field could learn a lot from open innovation, because this field has been just handling those practices or working with many of the tools, the platforms, the ways to engage with large people to handle those ideas for a much longer time. So there's much more experience, much more learning already in these areas. So it's definitely something to have a look at, and maybe learn also from some failures, avoid some pitfalls. At the same hand, of course, at least when we need to distinguish it in academic, if we have those different concepts, we have seen that what we try to define is in open innovation, the tools and the approaches very often have been quite focused on specific technologies or technological problems or more product related problems. Still, I think many of the things can be applied. And I know there are approaches that also look at, let's say, even innovative business models. And as you mentioned, foresight and strategic foresight, of course, those are things that are just very, very closely related to open strategy. And sometimes if you look at the questions that are addressed in open strategy initiatives, they could even be addressed or seen as a foresight project. If we say, okay, what is happening in the future? What trends might be relevant? What scenarios can we look at? So I think, yes, there is a way to bring this together, and all of those three fields learn from each other and also be integrated, because I think it's not really helpful within, for example, to exaggerate in an organization to have people that work with open innovation projects, and then you have people that work with open strategy projects. I think that's something that should be related, that should inform each other. Maybe you might have different tools and approaches that work better for a specific kind of question, but that doesn't necessarily have to be limited to, let's say, that's strategy and that's innovation. I would either look at the question that is asked and then see what works. So I think, yes, there is a way to bring them closer together, to learn from each other, inform each other, and see what happened in the other field.
Thank you. Let's round off with the two last raised hands. So,
Oh, lucky me then. It's very interesting because when I raised my hand, you were still asking your question, but it's very related, Peter, with your answer, Julia, because I've seen a lot of openness, and I love openness, and I think it's a fantastic tool. And I've seen a lot of that in, for example, open innovation in companies and ideation with external academia or other companies or hackathons. But fundamentally, the culture of decision making in the company has not changed, and we go back to some of the other things that we have said before, it kind of lip service or that approach of, oh, we are more and more open, but we are still making decisions in the floor up there and 10 people only. And it's very interesting to see how that comes back to some of the comments that we were saying at the very beginning about the mindset and ways of getting things done and decision-making culture and things like that.
Yeah.
It's more a comment than a question.
No, but it's very true. And maybe, and that's also just an assumption, now with open strategy, we see that CEOs might be a little bit more stressed out than they were with open innovation, because the innovation process was still something, okay, that's their department. Let's do the hackathons, but it's just about the next product. It's not necessarily, they can do that, that's fine. We give them the task, it's okay. But when we talk about open strategy and opening up that, it comes into, let's say, that's their task. That's how they define themselves. That's where they see their responsibility. That's how they justify why they are there. So it seems like it's not so easy to say, okay, they can do that and we do not feel affected. And that's why you can really see, and I think that is a big takeaway that we always stress when we talk about open strategy, just very, very closely linked to leadership and the type of leaders that you have, and how they handle it and how they approach it. And if they take it like seriously and let it flow into their decision making and consider it, or be open and say, okay, we can't consider it now, but that's what we done. Or if they do it and then have it as a side project. So currently, and that's another area of the research that we're doing, we're really looking on what does openness in the strategy process does with the leader, his own perception of his role, his identity as a leader, brings it some role conflict, some role ambiguity. So this is what we're exploring at the moment, because I think it brings a lot of implications for the classical leadership role that might have to change.
Really fascinating.
A quick comment on that is actually the similarities or the metaphor with what has already happened within open innovation. No one expects an innovation manager to come up with the innovations, right? They are there to facilitate the innovations. And actually, you could apply the same mindset to the leadership. No, you're not expected to come up with a strategy. You just need to facilitate the strategy development, right?
Exactly, that's the good point. But that's not how, at least current leaders perceive themselves and are trained. That's not how they see their own role. And I think that would be the perfect shift, to see that they see themselves as facilitators. I would think it would take some pressure off them, to be honest. But of course, it's difficult to have this shift in their minds.
Okay, Björn, final question.
Yeah, I was just going to comment, because we took one step backwards, so to speak, on the earlier, which is open innovation. But before that, you had the open source, which is really community driven. And what I wanted to say, because there you have a very long track record, and you can see very successful open source, but you can also see several failed ones.
Exactly.
Where the community don't want to deliver. And I think if I have understood correctly, the reason that some fail and some succeed is that people feel a sense of belonging in a successful community. They think that it's something good for them. So I do something good to contribute, because people work for free in doing it. So I think it's really something where you can study how does openness work with such a technical thing, and why, and more importantly, why does it fail? That was just a comment, or maybe something like that.
Yeah, very good point. I think that's the origin of all those openness movements, where open source. So I think that is something where we can learn a lot and see a lot. And this is also where the sense of community developed. I think a very good point, very true.
Thank you. And maybe just as an end note here also, I think you mentioned the open software, but there's also this movement of crowdsourcing. And I remember reading from a book called The Wisdom of Crowds. Also, there's some interesting trade-offs there as well in terms of if you want to get the correct amount of pebbles in a jar, then the crowd always wins. But if you want to figure out the best chess move, then it's usually not the crowd, because that gives you just basically an average answer. So there you might need some more specialization, but super interesting. And Julia, I thank you for your time. I really want to also reach out to you regarding my day job and maybe bring you in there in context, but I'll send you an email. Yes, Geraldo, you want to say something as well?
No, I want to thank as well, Julia.
You're muted.
And so many questions. I put some in the chapter, but one I could not let it be to just mention. I think I mentioned to you before, latest years working in marketing, where it is a discipline that is a new world in a company compared to strategy working. If we in strategy work with the McKinseys, then all of a sudden you were working with the PR companies and so on and so forth. And there will be definitely in the future something that will hopefully help marketing to open up, to use more the wisdom of the crowd. And so maybe the subject for your next book. We can write it together, maybe. Thank you so much, Julia. A reminder also, maybe, Peter, that we're going to have our town hall meeting right now. And you're very much welcome to stay, everybody, right? And thanks so much. And I just want to reach out if anybody that didn't have an opportunity to have any questions, if that's the time. Otherwise, thanks a lot. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Julia.
Thank you very much, Julia.
Thank you for the great discussion. And if anybody wants to reach out, of course, very happy to discuss further, also in any kind of format. So thank you.
Have a nice evening.
Thank
Bye.
Have a good evening.
Thank you.